Okay, now I'm going to share the screen, and I'll get it out. I've got it here already on. Okay.
Excellent, thanks. So, and I think you have to bear with me. I'll have to ask Bonnie to move on to the next slide every time. So what's the best way of doing that, Bonnie? Did I just say next slide? Does that work for you? Right, so there's a few, if you bear with me, the first few slides is a bit text on, but that's really because I wanted to give context. And I think the key thing really is that I think generally we tend to think of land as a commodity, and actually as something that belongs to somebody, and that they've, once they own it, they've got the right to sort of do what they want with it. And I'm sure to those of you from Bonnie's organisation, others know that more than I do. But I think it's just worth in the back of our mind always that we, as a community of interest, if you like, see ourselves really as kind of guardians and stewards of the country. Although we may own it technically, we see ourselves very much as the, you know, passing it on for future generations rather than something that we've got the right to do anything with. Okay, Bonnie. So recently, just the reason I've got put quite a bit of text up, I'm going to read these next 3 slides to you, but it's quite interesting. We just commissioned, so I've been with the trust is about 37 years old, and I noticed on the screen there's some former trustees and staff on it, so there's been people that have been there right from the beginning, probably know it more than me. So I've only been with the trust for about 12.5 years, but we recently just commissioned one of our comms person who's actually was a former journalist to do a bit of research into the trust. And he's just writing a very brief thing, which is fascinating. It's just to remind us all where we came from. And so for a bit of background, the genesis of the trust can be traced back to 1982, when Major Nigel Chamberlain MacDonald put the 55,000 acre Knoydart estate up for sale, which is in the far west of Scotland, one of the most remote bits of the country, really. He had been a benign and popular landowner, especially in comparison to some of his predecessors, who included the notorious Nazi sympathiser Lord Brocket. So there was naturally some concern within the local community and among mountaineers and conservationists over the future of the peninsula. These fears were heightened when the Ministry of Defence, supported by the Highlands and Islands Development Board, as it was then called, and the Scottish Landowners Federation, as they were also then called, expressed an interest in buying Knoydart and turning the entire into a military training zone. And we have, as you probably know, up at Cape Wrath in the northwest of Scotland, one of the only NATO live bombing ranges in Europe. And so there was obviously concerns that not just it would be a training zone, but it could end up being obliterated by all sorts of munitions. Thanks, Bonnie. So the possibility that this rugged and remote landscape would be scarred by military infrastructure and that public access could be severely curtailed brought together a loose coalition of resistance that included the local population, climbers, hill walkers, and ecologists. Those opposing the plan included a group of 4 people with strong local connections to Knoydart, who in the first few weeks of 1983 founded the John Muir Trust. Its mission statement encapsulated the focus of the new organisation, which was to conserve and protect wild places with their indigenous animals, plants and soils for the benefit of present and future generations so they can inspire people and maintain or repair natural processes. We aim to do this by working with the local community and by stimulating public interest. Okay, thanks, Bonnie. To further these aims, the Trust focused on the idea of changing land ownership, initially in Knoydart itself. Writing the Herald newspaper in 1999, Chris Brasher, who of the famous Brasher book, for those of you that know it, and was one of the original founders, later recalled a meeting of the 4 John Muir Trust founders to discuss a draft paper entitled The Knoydart Foundation. As an alternative to Ministry of Defence takeover, the paper envisaged some form of local ownership for the peninsula. And thus, from the beginning, long before the idea of community land became embedded into the mainstream political agenda in Scotland, we were sort of already anticipating how new forms of ownership might conserve wild landscapes and safeguard the economic and social well-being of the local population. So all these years later, we're still, as you'll see, very much involved in that. The good news, as you'll also see, is actually in terms of the Scottish Parliament, since its devolution, has moved quite swiftly and quite radically on quite a lot of these issues. So I think it's obviously our context is quite different than the UK Westminster Parliament. And Wales has got some powers too. So we're in a different place, but hopefully you'll see that this is, there's a lot of, we can all learn from this. Thanks, Bonnie. So for those of you that don't know, what is wild land? And one of the challenges of working for the John Muir Trust is that, unlike something like the RSPB, where it sort of does what it says on the tin, it's about birds, first of all, we're named after John Muir, and it's possibly might have not escaped some of your notice that John Muir has been, if you like, as some of his early writings have been caught up in the debate about, racist views that were held at the time when he was writing. And we've got, if you're interested, we've got a bit about that on our website. But once you get beyond John Muir and work out who he was and who he is, you then get into what's wild land. And so wild land is really an interesting thing. I guess in a European or particularly an American context, it would probably be called wilderness, and that's a term that would be familiar to people. But in the Scottish context, certainly in a UK context, that term has got very pejorative meanings because of the Highland clearances, for example. And so we talk very much about wild land, recognising that every square centimetre of the land has had some human impact on it, and has been used by people in the past or the present. So we talk very much more about wild land. Okay. And there is a, if you like, a sort of scientific or a geographical basis to wild land. And this slide shows some of the mapping that's done around wildland and the kind of criteria that are used to form these, for those of you familiar with GIS, these sort of layers that then come together to give you where the wildest land is, if you like. And you probably won't be surprised to see that London probably comes up with not very much wildland, and the further north and west you go, the greater the wildland concentration is, if you like. And there are pockets in England, particularly in the Lake District areas in blue, and bits in Snowdon, North Wales. But it is worth saying this is a kind of, it's very much an experiential criteria as well as a physical criteria. So it's people can experience wildness and wild land anywhere. And as I'm sure during lockdown, as we all know, you can get a tremendous amount of wild experience in a park nearby or a green space. So it's not saying it's exclusively this, but it's saying in terms of large scale, uninhabited, rugged, the most natural, if you like, in terms of, I'll come on to possibly the fact that a lot of our land actually isn't that natural. We've had intensive land use, whether it's grazing by herbivores or burning, but it's the most natural that we have and the minimum sort of evidence of human artifacts. So it's kind of, it can be mapped and it has been mapped and it is mapped, but it's also something you experience. But there is something called wild land, and that's kind of like, if you like, our USP. Thanks, Bonnie. And interestingly, in terms of legislation, in planning policy certainly, which is, if not quite pseudo legislation, it's not primary. It's in planning guidance. The wildland areas were, in what we saw as a great victory, if you like, were formally recognised in 2014 by the Scottish Natural Heritage, which is the government conservation agency, and is referred to in Scottish Government planning policy. And this map here shows the 42 wildland areas stretching from Shetland up in the far northeast, right down to the Galloway area in the southwest. So actually a really big chunk of the country, which you can see from here, something like 20% of the land area of Scotland, between 20 and 20%, is actually designated. Well, not designated. It's mapped as wild land, and that has a particular planning consideration at the moment. That's all. We have been in the past, and probably are considering again. We would really favour designation as one way of protecting that, so a way that's recognised and protected, because we think these areas are particularly special for a whole range of reasons for the whole of society. For mental health and well-being, for biodiversity, for climate change mitigation, for soaking up peat and soaking up water and soaking up carbon. And so we think they should be really specially recognised. But at the moment, they are acknowledged, at least in planning policy. Okay. And interestingly, life is never simple. And as I say, in a conservation, we find ourselves in an unusual position where we're actually opposing, in certain circumstances, in a very small number, of something that the rest of society really thinks is a good idea, which is renewable energy. And I should be clear and say that we're not against renewable energy, but what we are against is inappropriate developments in the wrong place and in the wrong area. And for those of you not familiar with when I talk about wind farms in Scotland, these are huge structures. They're much, each turbine is bigger than the London Eye. and you can have up to 30, 40, 50, 60 of them located with literally hundreds of kilometers of bulldozed track to get to them. So while they are absolutely part of the solution in terms of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and in terms of generating renewable energy, it's probably fair to say that a lot of the developments in the most sensitive habitats really have also got a lot of negative impacts. And so the John Muir Trust has been involved in some high profile campaigning against some of these developments. I should say it's something like 2 or 3% of all the renewable wind farm that come forward. So we're not, as I say, we're not against them in the right area. And actually the wildland area map, one of the criteria for it is in terms of wind developers looking for areas to put up their wind farms, they have to take this wildland area into consideration and ideally won't stray into it. And so far that's actually held, as you'll see, I think in the next slide, possibly. Yeah, sorry, no, right. Well, this is just to give you again the idea of what we're talking about. So you can see the chap Alex Sutherland there in the right-hand side to give you an idea of the scale of some of these tracks. We're not talking about a little quaint track. We're talking about something that's fairly significant with a digger that goes right into the hillside. And one of the challenges we have is that a lot of the soils, and that map I showed you of wild land also correlates very well with peatland and the carbon content of the soil. So actually these soils are very high carbon content, and actually turning them over and digging them up actually releases quite a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the calculations need to be taken into account, the payback period, if you like, of the wind farm. But I think it's fair to say that they're not the clean green energy sometimes people think of. Thanks, Bonnie. So in terms of that development, I've got a slides here which just show you the extent of the renewable energy wind farm development. So the maps are going in dated order from left to right, and the areas in green are where you can see, where if you're standing on the hill anywhere, you can see a wind farm from. So in 2000, if you like, wind farms started to be built and erected around Scotland, and by 2005 you can see their spread. Next slide, please. And then by 2010, if you go left to right, and so what you kind of get the impression is that actually, if you drive anywhere around Scotland now, you're going to see a wind turbine. And as I say, for a lot of people, some people think they're really attractive and they're great to be seen that this is producing endless renewable energy. But for other people, they're quite an intrusion, and they're an imposition in terms of noise and the infrastructure that goes with them, the grid connections, the substations. And so actually what this map really shows you is that there's the areas of wild land that were the 42 areas that were protected are pretty much all that's kind of left, really. And so they have done the job in terms of holding back the line of developments into these most sensitive remote and rural areas. So that's just to give you a context that when we talk about wild land, it's fair to say it's contested. It means different things to different people. And as a conservation charity, while we work with communities and we work with trying to manage and own land, we also recognize that there is conflict. And so there are lots of people that will say these wind turbines produce jobs for local communities, or they produce community benefits. So quite a lot of the developers put proceeds towards their profits into local communities, and they have got those benefits. But actually a lot of them are owned by big multinational companies, and the landowner gets a lot more money than everybody else. So there is an argument actually to say that if you're really going to do this at a national scale, it should really be nationalized, and that we should be getting the benefits of this in terms of our electricity, whereas in fact this is all very much private development. Anyway, that's a slight tangent, but just to give you a context. Okay, next slide, please. So as I say, this is actually, for those of you that know Ben Nevis, this is the Carmore Jerrigaret on our property that we manage, the top of Ben Nevis. And so this stunning view you see here out, this is kind of wild land, which is probably in good weather like this is, probably a parallel to anywhere in the world in terms of a sense of wildness and wonder. And yet Ben Nevis to the right here gets over 110,000 people a year going up it. So we facilitate a lot of people get an experience of this, albeit on a busy path, but they can also wander in Scotland wherever they want, further astray, and experience it. But wildland is certainly something that's contested. Thanks, Bonnie. And when these wildland areas maps, when it were presented and came into the sort of Planning Act in 2014, there was in two of these sort of very high circulation local newspapers we have in Scotland, the Press and Journal and the West Island Free Press. There was two contrasting views. There was a warning that wild land could be seen as a block on development and a block on progress. But actually there was also, at the same time, when a public opinion poll was done, that there was, I think it's something like 4-to-1 support for the idea of wild land and protecting this resource, recognizing that renewable energy is renewable, but wild land is finite, and once it's gone, it's gone. Okay, thanks, Bonnie. So that's just a bit of context. That's a bit about the John Muir Trust and a bit about what wild land is and how we try and fight to protect it, but we're also about supporting and engaging with community. So one of the things in those findings statement was that it's also very much about you know, trying to get natural processes back. So if you like, the wind farm side of the argument is about the landscape impacts. My own background is more from an ecology point of view, and so there's also the ecological argument. And so what we try and have done, worked with various communities over the years that have similar objectives to ourselves. And I guess we would argue that truly sustainable development, if you like, isn't really three pillars. It's a pyramid on which the environment supports everything else. And you can't really have social and economic justice and benefits unless you've got a healthy environment. And in many ways we have, in lots of the uplands in the UK, not just Scotland, we've got a two-dimensional, very grazed, burnt environment, whereas we should really have much more woodland, which is a three-dimensional space which provides a lot more for opportunities for all sorts of wildlife and for people. So we've been involved in communities that have a similar vision to us. And again, we've had quite a long history of being involved in that. Thanks, Bonnie. So in 1992, we backed the very first buyout in Scotland, which was actually a crofter buyout rather than a community buyout. There is a bit of a difference. So the crofters, if you like, have got particular land tenure, which allows them to be tenants of land by law. But there are other members of the community in a crofting community that don't necessarily have that land. 1992, Egg was also bought by community buyout, and that was a tripartite agreement between a local community trust that bought the island, the Scottish Wildlife Trust, another NGO a bit similar to ourselves, and the equivalent to the sort of council development board that was there as well. And then in 1993, we supported the purchase of the Wildwood in the Borders, which is a valley that local people took over, and they've just published a book actually, which is excellent recently. And since the millennium, they've done 20 years of ecological restoration there. We also helped the Neudart Foundation, so that foundation that was talked about, that came to being, and they bought the big chunk of the Neudart Peninsula. And then in the Western Isles, there's the North Harris Community Buyout, the Ascent Foundation. So most of these are up in the Northwest Highlands. I should say, and I'll come on to in terms of community land ownership, there are lots of assets in urban areas as well. So there's been lots of community halls, toilets, old industrial buildings, all sorts of things bought over by communities for all sorts of benefits and using. But we are mainly talking here about from a rural context and for these large areas of wild, rugged land. Thanks, Bonnie. And this keeps going up until today. And I think what's really interesting is all the agreements we've been in. I suppose it's fair to say when the community, there's always a bit of excitement around a community buyout, and there's, you know, the community feels empowered, and they take the asset and they get the keys. And there's an iconic image of the Ascent Crofters Trust of Alan McRae, the first sort of standing with a bottle of champagne on the top of, looking out at Sylvan on an iconic mountain. But then what happens with time, obviously, is that, like everything else, that what private landowners tended to have was quite deep pockets, and they tend to be paying for things. And once the grants and the excitement runs out, things get really challenging, and it's usually the volunteers that are doing it within the community, and you know, they move or they change or they get tired. So I think it's quite interesting that over the years there has been some stresses and strains in the communities, but we like to think it's good to see that one of the roles we have as an NGO is we can draw on a much bigger base, and we can help support, as and with, not just with money, but with sort of staff or expertise or advice when and if required. And so that's interesting in terms of community, if you like, land trusts and different models that exist in other countries. But I guess we sort of have a bit of a role like that here, in that we help some of these communities. So these agreements have stood the test of time. So the West Harris Trust has re-signed a new agreement with us, and they're still keen that we're partners together. Thanks, Bonnie. At the same time, and I can't say whether we were, how much influence we had on this, but there was instrumental at the same time, if you like, was a history of land reform in the Scottish Parliament. So one of the things that happened when the Parliament came into being in 1999, one of the first acts that came through was the Land Reform Act. Thanks, Bonnie. And the first Land Reform Act in 2003, by the time it finally got through the Scottish Parliament, had three parts to it. The first part was the access rights, and that was, in effect, enshrined in law what was kind of already the case, which was the right to roam effectively or the right for responsible access. So effectively, you can walk anywhere out with somebody's garden, or curtilage, as it's called in Scotland, as long as you behave responsibly. You can go anywhere and do anything. So you have the right to wild camp, you've got the right to bike, to take a horse, with a few minor exceptions, as long as you do so responsibly. And responsibly doesn't mean having a big fire and leaving all your litter and all the rest of it. So post-lockdown, there's actually been quite a lot of challenges, because a lot of people have been desperate to get into the countryside, and understandably have got out into the countryside, but there has been some tensions over that, because unlike in other parts of the UK, you know, it's fairly unrestricted. The second part of the Act that was the community right to buy, and that basically set in place a chain of, if you like, events that if a landowner indicates he wants to sell land, the community needs to set up a constituted body and register. And if it's been registered for a certain period of time, it can then basically, if it can then have the right to buy if it can raise the money which is the market value. And there's a whole series of things about that. I guess what's interesting, I'll come on to, is that unfortunately that land prices are, as you can imagine, are only going in one direction. And so for a lot of communities, even in the 20 or 30 years that the Trust has been going, the land prices have gone up steeply, much steeper than anything else. So the idea of a community buying a large area of land now, as we'll come on to with Langham, is a major financial undertaking. And then part three was, I mentioned before, for those of you not familiar, there's a different type of land tenure in the north and west called crofting, and basically a slightly different process, but it gave the collective of crofters, again, the right to consider buying if the landlord put something up for sale. So that was the first Land Reform Act in 2003. And then more recently, and it seems just like yesterday, but actually it was 2016, the second Land Reform Act came in, and it has a whole range of other provisions. But basically it's moving, well, so the second thing, the main thing it did actually is part two, is it recognized that land reform wasn't a one-off, wasn't going to be dealt with just by legislation, and it was an ongoing process. And so they set up a Scottish Land Commission, and that basically is the vehicle by which continual land reform will happen. So they make recommendations to government, they can suggest new legislation, they can make guidance for individuals, they can do research, a whole range of powers. And that basically is to try and ensure that this isn't just a matter of, you know, acts 13 years apart, but actually this will be a continual process. The other bits, which I won't go into all of them, but they are, interestingly, well, there's various things. So there's part one really sets out what responsible land ownership looks like. Part three talks about a public register effectively of who owns the land, so that there's a lot of, still a lot of it, and Bonnie mentioned Andy Whiteman earlier on, so he's done a lot on in the early days about who owns Scotland, but it's still actually quite hard to find out through the way land is registered through various shell companies or offshore companies as to who actually owns it. And there's now, you know, legislation in place to, I think it's actually meant to be by, certainly if not this year, then certainly very soon, that all land should be accessible and onto that register. And then part five is the right to buy land to further sustainable development. So the government can actually intervene if they think land isn't being managed sustainably. Obviously, that's a bit of a weasel word, and you know, we talked about the wind turbines earlier on, and one person's sustainability might not be the same as everyone else, but at least it gives you that opportunity. Part six was to do with the fact that under, I think it was the John Major government, that the if you like, a tax that people pay on having what's called deer forests, which are large areas held for sporting, that tax was abolished. This has now been reinstated, so that people pay money for that privilege, if you like, and various other bits and pieces tidying things up. Thanks, Bonnie. And yeah, so, and I say that if you go on to the next slide as well, we're pleased to see that the Land Right and Responsibility, if you like, publishes sort of examples of what it should be, how it should manage, and actually we're delighted to highlight here that one of the case studies is a partnership we're involved in around one of our properties in the centre of Scotland, which is a Heart of Scotland Forest Partnership, where we've worked with a private estate, the public through the, if you like, Forest Land Scotland, which used to be the Forest Commission, a community-owned wood next door to us, and ourselves and other NGOs. So I guess what they're trying to show here is that there are examples of where people are working together for a common sustainable conservation aim, involving all sorts of different type of landowners. So they give various case studies about how they think land use should look like. Thanks, Bonnie. And as I say, the Scottish Land Commission was set up, and its website, for those of you interested in anything from legal to they did a really good review a few months ago, looking at all different land tenure models across Europe, and different how they work. And so there's a lot of information on there, and that Land Commission is, as I say, is basically making sure that land reform is an ongoing process. Thanks, Bonnie. So just to kind of take that to its natural conclusion, we've been involved most recently and are still very much involved in, I want to just touch on two recent community, if you like, projects that kind of dovetail with our own objectives and land reform. So the first one is the Langham Moor Community Buyout Appeal, which we've pledged some money towards, and we're actually helping in other ways too. And if you next slide, please. So this is the next few slides of the brochure from the Langham Moor themselves. It's really interesting, this, in that, again, it's right actually on the border. It's right on the English border, and there's two towns, Langham and Newcastleton, that are on either side of one piece of land. And this is a part of the Duke of Buccleuch, who's one of the biggest landowners in Scotland. They used to be able to own land from, I think, right from one coast to the other, from the North Sea to the Atlantic, across the centre, across the southern Scotland there. And this piece of land is actually even more notorious in the sense that it was a well-known grouse moor that was subject to two very long-term projects, really trying to ask the question, can driven grouse shooting go hand in hand with hen harrier conservation, because the area is designated to protect a rare raptor, a rail bird of prey called the hen harrier, and unfortunately, to generate high densities of grouse for wealthy people to shoot, raptors like hen harriers tend to get illegally killed. And so this was trying to demonstrate whether or not the two could work together. And I think it's probably fair to say at the end of about two 10-year projects and a large amount of money, the conclusion was that you couldn't really have both. You couldn't really manage to get healthy harrier populations and big enough game bags to make grouse shooting sustainable. So whether it was that or some other reason, Buccleuch Estates decided to put this piece of land on the market, along with other things. And initially, it was just marketed as a grouse moor, but the local community got wind of it, and they exercised the various bits of legislation to register their interest, to set up a community body, which in fact they were for something different, and have then tried to set about buying this grouse moor. And that is pretty much, I think, started in about spring 2019, so we're kind of a year and a half in. Unfortunately, they launched a crowdfunding appeal just as we kind of went into lockdown, so obviously for a whole range of reasons probably wasn't the best, unfortunately, the best time, but they're hidebound by the fact that they need to have raised a significant amount of money by October to be able to access some money from the Scottish Government through the Scottish Land Fund, which helps this type of initiative. So the asking price, which is based on a market valuation, so it's fair and open, but it's in the order of £6 million for several thousand hectares, which I'm thinking possibly in terms of London prices may not seem much, but in terms of land prices, that's pretty steep. So anyway, the community has put together a brochure to try and explain what they're doing, and why we got interested in is that they cover all the bases that we're interested in. So they're talking about, they see ecological restoration as a way of regenerating the community. Langham used to be a big textile town, and with textile manufacturing moving, overseas, wherever it faced a lot of challenges. Interesting, there's also something called the common ridings in the borders, which is where which is where every year the community gets together and rides around the boundaries. And then the interesting thing there is that that actually used to be what's known as common land. So it was actually in a different, not croft land, but more like English common land. It was actually common land, and there's an interesting history as to how the Duke of Buccleuch ended up getting it, being granted by a king, I think. So it actually did sort of belong to the people originally, but now they're having to buy it back from a very wealthy landowner. But actually, they also recognise that the community also recognises that the land could do a lot more in all sorts of things. So Driven Grouse Moor relies on bare ground being burnt continually, whereas actually there's potential here to get some woodland restoration, which would help to block some of the ditches, to get peatland restoration, and that would help with climate mitigation. It would help us, say, lock up carbon and reduce water flooding. It would also help with biodiversity, and they're also really keen on looking at all sorts of nature-based economies, from responsible tourism to mountain bike trails to visitor centres, a whole range of things. Thanks, Bonnie. So, so basically, the people Langham are hoping to buy nearly 10,000 acres, and as I say, they've had to go out into community appeal. Interestingly, as I say, there's a boundary right through the middle of the land, and there's another community on the other side, Newcastleton, and they've already been through this process, and they've now managed to buy about 700 acres, I think, just around about the community. So it's not nearly as big as this. And so there is a big chunk of land that's going to be between that and community. So unfortunately, it's just an artifact of geography, but there could be an even bigger project. But it's, at the moment, it's only this side of the hill. The two things that are out with, so part of this area, as I say, is protected for hen harriers, but out with that protection, the two biggest, most likely land uses that would happen if this was to be bought, if it wasn't for a grouse moor, would be for commercial woodland, so for Sitka spruce plantations, or potentially for a big wind farm as well. So, and again, the community of both these local communities have decided that really neither of those options generate much in the way of jobs or livelihood or look particularly attractive around their communities. So they're keener to do this. Thanks, Bonnie. So, and actually, in the first, what they're really keen to declare is trying to actually create a nature reserve, a national nature reserve, which is a designation that the government SNH can give to you. It's not the same protection, but it's basically about somewhere people can visit. Thanks, Bonnie. And as I say, they see very much the opportunities in terms of nature-based tourism, in terms of outdoor education, including something called the John Muir Award, which we're also very proud that we're involved in. And basically, yeah, a whole range of opportunities that, and I think the experience from other communities having bought land themselves or in partnership with NGOs or others is that it just, it's as much psychological as physical, but it actually just unlocks a whole range of potential of thinking what you can do with the land, which you just haven't thought about before because you didn't have that option. And so I think there's it'll generate a big buzz, hopefully. Thanks, Bonnie. So the people very much see it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And also, interestingly, there's another community not far away called Wanlock Head, which is in Lead Hills, which by its name suggests it used to be a lead mining area, which again, the Duke of Buccleuch has also put up for sale. And they're a bit further down the process, but they've been in touch too. They're really keen on looking at how they can take that on. So I think if you like, there has been there's like a new flourishing, partly actually caused by the climate emergency and people recognizing that the land around them could do so much more. But there's a new interest now in community land ownership. But one of the biggest challenges that we face really is the land price and the land value. And I suppose it's fair to say it's hard to, I mean, as I say, it's based on a market price, but there is some disquiet about paying a very wealthy person £6 million when they've got, a private owner. And there's a bit of pressure being put on the Duke of Buccleuch to say, well, is there any way you could reduce the price or make a donation or, give this to the community or something. So anyway, so those discussions are ongoing. In fact, there's a thing on Channel 4 News about that very topic a few nights ago. Thanks, Bonnie. So another project, just finally, just to touch on another project, which is quite a different approach. So this actually doesn't involve land ownership yet, although I think the community again are looking at options. But this is again, probably even more of a rewilding project. I think it's fair to say that the Langham Initiative, although it is rewilding, doesn't necessarily use that name. So it talks more about ecological restoration or a nature reserve. This Jernstein project is very much front and center about rewilding, and they're quite happy to use that term. And that's, next slide, Bonnie, thanks. That's, again, very much, so it's taking a rewilding approach. So it's talking about large-scale ecological restoration for the benefit of the environment, the local community, and the economy. And the Jernstein project has the potential to significantly regenerate the area. So this is a big area. I'll show you in a map in a minute, but it's just actually right on the doorstep of Glasgow. It's surrounded by a huge range, a big range of pre-industrial and fairly deprived urban communities. And it really has an opportunity there to restore and enhance the ecosystem, to restore functioning bog, increase areas of native woodland, and reintroduce recently lost species. And a lot of you will think of rewilding as being bears and wolves and lynx, but actually here there's things like adders and blaeberry and black grouse and a whole range of species that disappeared relatively recently in the last 20 years, which is, and it's such a short period, they've got an opportunity to bring them back if the habitat can be restored. Also seeing that it involves local communities with large centres of population, as I mentioned. And again, like lots of the country, particularly this is further west than Langham, but a bit like the Lake District and other areas of the western seaboard, you know, whether it's climate change or whatever, but we're getting far more severe rain events, and actually the flood damage in this area because of these conurbations round about it is phenomenal. So actually there's an economic argument to say if you could slow down that water, let it percolate more into the soil, let it transpire through plants and through vegetation, you'd actually reduce the flood damage too. And again, similarly to Langham, looking at the opportunity to develop lots of local businesses and social enterprises, from farm shops to everything, you know, to mountain bike trails, to a whole range of stuff that could be generated from this area. Thanks, Bonnie. So yeah, so this is it here. So it's actually right on the edge of Glasgow Airport, and there's Kilwinning, Johnston, Port Glasgow, Largs, these areas round about it. And at the moment there's a there's a kind of hub, if you like, centred on what's a regional park. There's 2 regional parks in Scotland, which are sort of an unusual thing. They're not national parks, and the local authority has them. And local authorities, in fact, in this case, there's 2 local authorities run them, the Clyde Muirshire Regional Park. And as you could probably imagine, local authorities are really strapped for cash and have been kind of really cutting back on all the staff and investment in this. So there is also a local group at the moment looking at trying to buy the park and looking at how that would work. And they're a subset of the people that are involved in this rewilding project. So again, there could be an element of the community actually taking on this asset at some point in the future. Thanks, Bonnie. Yes, so this is the regional park at the moment. So it has got various infrastructure, but a lot of it is fair to say is probably you know, being de-invested in rather than invested in. So an exciting opportunity. Thanks, Bonnie. And actually also, you'll see I mentioned right back at the beginning that the John Muir Trust had a particular locus in terms of wildland areas, and the 42 wildland areas. And this area this is wildland area number 4, and that's the blue line of it here. So it's actually also recognised as a wildland area, which gives us more sort of buy-in as well. Thanks. And interestingly, so we as the John Muir Trust have been asked to come and help, but actually there's 2 local social enterprises that are really behind it at the moment. There's Starling Learning here, and thanks, Bonnie. And the next one is AU, which is a social enterprise that uses basically unemployed and other groups to plant trees, and they've done lots of aspen, particularly planting all over the area. So yeah, so again, this is driven by 2 social enterprises. Yeah, and finally, just to sort of go back to the old classic Aldo Leopold, but I think what we see this is really trying to be part of a movement, if you like, which is really trying to, you know, look at how we see land much more than just a commodity, really, and that also but we also need to bear in mind the other members of the species that are on the planet. Not just so it's not just about so I guess it's not just about community ownership of land and management, but community ownership and land with a wild land and a wild animal and plant and biodiversity interest too. Thank you, Bonnie. And I think that's me. So you've probably heard more than enough from me now.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. That's really interesting. So Alec, if you could unmute yourself, and if you want to go straight to the floor, I think, for questions. And are you ready there? And also if people, the chat should be on, so if people do want to type in comments or put in some questions, someone will be keeping an eye on that at the same time.
Yep. Hello everyone, if you want to put your hand up as well, that's a useful way of seeing who has a question. Is there anyone? Okay, so maybe I'll ask a question while we wait for people to think of some. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for that talk. That was really interesting. We did have a question that we wanted to ask you about the impacts of the Land Reform Act in Scotland, and whether there's any policies in particular that you would like to see coming forwards in the future that would be of benefit to your work.
So I think the legislation is good, and it's a good step. I think, as I say, the two things maybe. One, the fact there's a land commission. So again, recognizing it's not just a case of just putting in legislation, but actually a much more involved process. As I say, the key thing has really been that so it's all very well communities having a right to buy, but if they can't afford it, then what happens? And so we're really challenging the idea of the land fund. So there's a land fund at the moment which comes from a different taxation, but it's got I think 10 million in it, and each year, and that's coming to an end. So we're lobbying for more of that. And so again, yeah, whether it's a land valuation tax or some other mechanism, but something that would actually, if that's the way it's going to be sold, then that needs to go in. I suppose that's the second one. And then I guess the third one is more slightly a caution, that the idea of the right to buy land for sustainable development, that's a kind of double-edged sword. So as I say, sustainable means different things, and you could make a case for something that's quite ecologically destructive, but it's seen as being sustainable. And obviously I've given the examples of industrial scale renewable energy as one. So those three things, I guess, are just worth keeping an eye on.
Great. Oh, thank you. I see Colin McCulloch, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, well, greetings from Sheffield. I wanted to ask about the buying back land from these apparently and usually very wealthy landowners who presumably are the inheritors of the enclosures and what have you, and the nasty history from the 18th century onwards, or even before. And I make a contrast with the opposite of the commons or the public property of council houses being sold at enormous discounts to the residents, which was, at least in England, was happening in previous government eras. How is the market price actually set? Is there a danger that it's bid up somehow in order to price out the community?
So certainly in terms of the rural example like Langham, which I'm most familiar with recently, as I say, that's an independent valuer that's part of the legislation. So, and I think it's fair to say that the price, when at £6 million, also includes some farms, some buildings, some potential for small scale hydro energy, which would be great. Some, the bits of the business that might actually generate income rather than the beautiful wild land that sits on the top. But so I think it's probably fair to say, I mean, I don't know how yes, it's always difficult to know how you value anything. How do you value a house and where does that come from? But recognizing that, yeah, there are some checks and balances there to make it, so it is kind of transparent and fair, I think, in that regard. Whether the actual price is fair is a different question, but yes.
Yeah, there's an ethical question, I guess, but that's a different matter, perhaps. Yeah. That's not economics. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Colin. We have a question from Michael Griffiths. Michael, would you like to ask your question? See if I can. Michael? Oops. Oh, that's right. I think I can read it out. Michael is asking, what is the status of wind farm sites after decommissioning? Are they considered brownfields?
That is a good question. So we haven't had any decommissioning yet. All I can say is I'll have a look at that. Everyone, certainly only ones that are coming up to the end of their 25 or 20 years are all talking about repowering is the order of magnitude, and repowering with much bigger turbines that were in fashion 20 years ago. So, and actually it's really interesting to know because there's huge concrete bases go down underneath them. So it's really difficult to know what decommissioning would look like. But that's a good question. So I don't know the answer in terms of brownfield, sorry, but I can scribble that down and find out.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you, Michael, for an interesting one. We have a question from Suma Mani. Suma, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. My question is on the tree planting or aspect which you touched upon. So is this a major part of your rewilding project there? And what kind of species do you plan on planting?
So generally, yeah. So I mean, generally in rewilding projects, I think it's fair to say they are, because the climax vegetation over much of the UK, and with the exception of some of the deep peat areas in the far northwest of Scotland, would be woodland, and we've only got 4% of our native woodland cover, and about 14% in Scotland of woodland cover altogether. And absolutely, it's all about, a lot of it is about planting trees. Ideally, initially, actually, natural regeneration is the best way to go. So if there is a seed source and you can reduce the herbivores to very low levels for a period of time, those trees are adapted and you're not bringing in disease and a whole range of benefits. And there's actually the mycorrhiza in the soil, that the fungi that associate that are probably there already. So that's the first sort of, if you like, and then beyond that, yes, absolutely. As I say, there are all sort of interesting things. So for example, in the Langham area, they've identified large areas they will be able to plant. But ironically, the hen harrier, which it's designated for, actually likes it likes woodland edge or bare things. So in terms of the designation at the moment, they may have to maintain open habitats for the hen harriers, but that's fine. And certainly in the Ernstine, yes, absolutely. There's big areas of the Ernstine is different because it's not owned by the community or by the project at the moment. They're just trying to look at how they can get So yes, but absolutely, tree planting is a big part of lots of this.
Great, thank you, Suma.
I had a follow-up question. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Is the focus more towards carbon sequestration, or is it more towards improving habitats and biodiversity?
Yeah, I think for us, probably the latter, because there is an argument that says if you're just about carbon sequestration, you could probably plant soft conifers like Sitka spruce or Little Blight or something, and you'd lock up a lot of carbon quickly. There's also a bit of a kind of a backlash, and I don't know how much of it is driven by what it's driven by, but there is, the science, like anything in life, isn't totally black and white, so it's quite complicated. So that in some situations, you actually, even putting native trees in the ground, you will emit carbon for a long time before you start to get it back, and the payback period. So I think what is clear is that natural regeneration is certainly the least disturbing way to do it, because you're not disturbing the soil at all. But yeah, I think our focus, certainly in terms of rewilding, is much more on the biodiversity and the habitat, but the added benefit that it does certainly help climate mitigation. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Suma. We have a question from Toby Clark. Toby, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Mike. How you doing? My question is, since the Land Reform Act, why haven't more communities taken advantage? And I suppose, are there any sort of common barriers that are emerging, and barriers that we can help mitigate?
Yeah, no, thanks, Toby. Hello. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main one probably, well, there's two. I mentioned the financial one, but the main one actually is at the moment the legislation can really only be triggered if the owner puts it on the market. So there's a, in other words, it requires a willing seller first before somebody can buy hostile. There is provision in the legislation for more hostile buyout, but that requires an awful lot of legal hurdles to go through. Probably quite rightly so. But yes, I think that's probably the biggest one. And I guess, as I said too, as well as the financial price to buy, there is also real issues about what you do with the land going forward. So, I mean, one of the things, particularly in the Highlands, is that the reason that wealthy people own land, they don't get wealthy from owning the land. They own the land because they're wealthy, and a deer forest is like a football club. It's a sort of expensive hobby for a lot of landowners. And at the moment, the there are no subsidies really that would cover that. There's no public. So what we're looking at post Brexit, and if we had been in the EU cap reform, was how we, is paying, for example, for sheep, which it doesn't create a huge amount of employment and generates a product that, wool mainly, unfortunately, ends up in landfill sites nowadays. So there are other ways we can actually pay for ecosystem services, and actually that's being looked at in Wales, for example. But so yes, I think the biggest thing is that the landowner can get the community get the money to buy the land, but how do they then generate income to maintain jobs and houses on the land? And that's a big challenge too.
Great, thank you, Toby. There's a question from Karine. Karine, would you like to ask a question?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for this. This was very interesting. So I wanted to know more about Langholm area. If you could tell more about how was that negotiation between the community and the owner, and how was the government supporting them, if there was any support. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so actually, as you'll probably find in most communities, it's down to one or two really energetic and enthusiastic individuals that have driven the process. And actually, there's a negotiation with the community that happens as well, because it's fair to say we talk about community and that has a nice warm glow, but actually there's a community or a group of individuals that have got lots of different opinions. And actually a lot of people are maybe apathetic or not interested, and some people have strong views that actually like traditional land uses, so that they may have been involved in the grouse shooting industry and they want to maintain the status quo. Others may be more interested in keeping tourists out and having a nice quiet life or whatever. So there's a whole range of things. So I think there's a huge amount of work going on in terms of consulting with the community and trying to get a consensus, or at least to sort of allay fears and trying to build enthusiasm about that. So that's probably a bigger job almost, I would argue, than in terms of the landowner. To be fair to Buccleuch Estates, I think they have been, from what I understand, I mean, I'm sort of quite third party detached from this, so I'm not involved in anything directly, just been helping a little bit from the back sidelines, if you like. But they have been, they've been going very opening their books to, there's various processes to get evaluation and to help. So they've been very helpful, and there's been no sort of, no hostility there. I think from their point of view, they've argued, and their spokesman that was on the TV Channel 4 news piece was just saying, they are a business and that they need to get, business value for selling their asset as they see it. So that's the line they're giving, and so which I suppose is fair enough, and that's their call. So, but I think the negotiations in that sense are relatively straightforward. So you get an independent valuer, you agree a price, you sort out all the over the way leaves and all the other legal things. But that's relatively seems to have been relatively straightforward so far. Obviously, nothing. It hasn't. The crunch will come yet. As I say, I think what's probably more hard work, or more certainly is building that consensus of the community and taking them with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. We have a question from Sam Firth. Sam, would you like to ask a question?
Hi there, Mike. It's not actually Sam, it's Alistair. But I've got the wrong name on there. Mike, I was just wondering, GMT have been involved with a lot of community groups over time in Scotland. And there's obviously things going on in other places as well as just down in the borders. And I'm thinking, are you looking at working with other communities, similar projects, looking at restoration, rewilding, what have you, in other parts of Scotland, or even in England?
So, so I guess in the case certainly of Langham and Yarnston, we were approached, and so we're delighted to be approached. And the big issue for us is, like everyone, is capacity, and we're relatively a small charity, so we've only got 50 staff across the entire organisation, and that includes our engagement work, the John Muir Award, which includes our policy work, our land work, and all our sort of backroom staff. So we're actually quite a small ENGO compared to, for example, our SPB or whatever. So it's a capacity issue is a big thing. And then I guess the other thing is, as I say, we've got in terms of our charitable objectives, we've got a very clear wildland focus. So it would need to be a community that's interested in the wildland element. So there's lots of other great community, involvement in trying to take over assets that might not be, for example, in urban areas, or might have a different locus. So, so I guess that's the real sort of thing for us. In terms of England, interestingly, actually, we've had lease of Glenridding Common in Helvellyn for the last 3 years, and the National Park has just completed a consultation on that, and the local community, as in the parish council, has in that consultation has expressed a real interest in being involved, if not in taking it on entirely themselves, then possibly looking at working with us. So that's just literally hot off the press. So we're exploring that now, and that would be excellent, because again, that would sort of follow the model we're doing in Scotland and into England. So yes, so I guess what I'd say is we're always open to anything, but we do end up having to, capacity is a big issue, and staffing and resources, and so ideally if it fits with our sort of that wildland map and our key wildland area, or our sort of focus on, there's a range of things we could do, whether it's engaging with people. But so I didn't want to give a blank check to promise for every community to contact us, because we'll have to disappoint people, but certainly keen to look at anything that comes up.
Thank you. Great,
thanks, Alistair. While everybody else has a moment to think of any more questions they'd like to ask, I could ask another one actually. We're quite interested in whether you've ever found any potential conflicts between the need to generate employment in the projects and conservation, because it's traditionally seen as something that requires a sort of a trade-off, but I wonder whether in your experience and projects you find that they actually work hand in hand quite well.
So yeah, I can only really answer from so I should have also said that the John Muir Trust itself owns land, and I guess we would say we do that as on behalf of a community of interest as opposed to a community of place, although there is an overlap. Some of our members might live there, and also we kind of feel we recognise, we manage it for everybody. We had a study done, I think it was 2014 as well, and kind of looked at comparing across the piece actually with environmental NGOs, landowners in Scotland, so that's RSPB Scotland, National Trust for Scotland, etc. Sort of comparing, if you like, private land and conservation land, and actually in terms of jobs, the comparison was very favourable. So we could argue a bit that we'd increase the number of the amount of employment. I mean, there are lots of caveats, because obviously if you're managing somewhere that's, the reason we got involved in places is because they were popular or they were nature reserves or whatever, so it's not quite a fair comparison. But I think certainly we would say it certainly holds on, holds its own. I mean, one of the predominant land uses in the Highlands particularly is, as I say, the sort of the deer forest, inverted commas. Forest is ironic because there's not many trees. It's the different origins to the word. And actually, I think George Monbiot wrote a really good piece a while ago, looked at a report that the gamekeepers that are involved in that industry had produced, and basically made the comparison that actually it's a lower rate of employment than you find in the Arctic Circle. So actually it's not a very good, the current land model, if you like, isn't particularly impressive in terms of vast areas with a small number of people employed. So the fact we're doing more favourably in some of the bits we manage is maybe not as from a low base. But I think you're right. Yeah, no, I think there hasn't been a conflict in that sense. Certainly, if you were to ask anyone in a rural community, the two things they want are jobs and houses. And I guess we, as a landowner, provide a very small number of direct jobs and probably don't provide much in the way of housing. We're always open to look at what there is. But arguably, a massive industry is tourism. Obviously, there's issues with that at the moment. But certainly, tourism based on a beautiful wild natural landscape generates huge, vast amount of employment in the Highlands particularly. So I think we would argue that there isn't such a conflict, and actually, we can all work together. There's lots of potential there.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mike. We have a question from Georgie in London. Georgie, would you like to ask a question?
Hi. See if I can put my video on. Hi. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I've just actually been camping in the lake. So that's like a very relevant talk. I was just going to ask about like whether in your experience the community always does the right thing, and what kind of structures they might use to kind of make sure for sort of decision making. So I guess it's within those groups, there's no guarantee that there's kind of going to be agreement across all of their objectives and kind of the particulars of projects. So yeah, just a bit in terms of like how communities organise, what kind of constraints there might be in terms of the way they operate.
Thanks, George. That's a really good question. So I haven't had, as I say, so much direct experience on the actual mechanics of that, but you're absolutely right. We're looking at something at the moment with Langham in terms of governance, and governance is absolutely key in having something that's transparent and fair and really clear, and that you don't end up with a mafia or of keen interest whoever running it is absolutely vital. And I guess that's the same with any community structure, and having the right voting systems and the right all that kind of stuff. A slightly broader point is interesting is that I've always had this kind of Venn diagram in my head of four things so there's incentives, there's regulation, there's ownership, and then there's culture, and all those four things play out. So you can change the ownership, and you can have the incentives, and so for example the culture I talk about, like the deer stalking culture, if that predominates in an area, then despite the community might take it on and want to carry on running that model, and in which case nothing much will actually change from an ecological point of view. So I think you're right. So the ownership itself doesn't necessarily change anything if those other things don't change. If the incentives don't incentivize you to do the right thing, and you still get paid to put up Sitka spruce rather than native woodland or whatever. So I think that's absolutely key. And then you're right, yeah. As in the So it's not all sweetness and light, and as in communities there are lots of tensions and difficulties. But I think by and large, yeah, it's kind of like any sort of democratic structure that's as long as it's really clear and has its processes, it can work. But there's certainly challenges there.
Yeah, I guess that's the kind of interesting thing that like generally communities do tend to do the right thing. I guess it's to do with kind of the interest that communities have in taking that land. But yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks.
I mean, the only other thing to add, and what I didn't mention in the talk, is it's quite interesting about ultimately there's an interesting discussion to be had about public ownership and whether or not ultimately the best way to get the public interest would be for the public to own land. And our national parks in the UK are quite bizarre because they're not owned by the nation. They're owned by and large by private individuals, 80-90% of them, or some NGOs. Whereas if you go to a national park in America, it's owned by the nation, the state. And so there is a question about whether, so why is it that, shouldn't the public be owning more land? And actually, is that not a very democratic way of managing land through public ownership?
It's all right in Scotland, maybe not in England. Trust the Scottish government.
Great, thank you, Georgie. We have a question from Leslie. Leslie, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask, being an urban dweller and love urban settings, how much you saw this wildland as a possibility in an urban setting. Would there be too many conflicting needs so that it wouldn't be possible, or is it that there needs to be a large amount of land and that wouldn't be possible in an urban setting? I mean, the land that you showed near Glasgow, I thought that was maybe the closest you could get to a large built up urban, I don't know, but it seems, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think, as I said, that we endlessly, like any organization, we spend a long time debating words and go around on the head of a pin of what's wild land, what's wild places, what's wildness. And I think that we've got to got two sort of parallel approaches, which don't necessarily conflict. We've got very much a focus on in our engagement work, particularly through the John Muir Award, on, as I said earlier, that you can find the wildness in wild places anywhere. That you can have a small area by a canal, you can have your own garden. The scale is, and you can find a lot of the qualities and properties and a bit of peace and tranquility and biodiversity there. So we absolutely recognise that and encourage that. And actually, you can, in many ways, you can rewild a brownfield site, from an earlier question, much easier than you can a large area of upland that's been heavily grazed and burned for 200 years. So there's great potential. What we really, on the other hand, we also, this other parallel in terms of trying to get the sort of kind of rewilding idea. It really needs to be large scale, and it's really kind of a catchment from summit to sea, from the water source right through out into the ocean and beyond, to try and make a big ecological difference on enough large, to try and get a self-sustaining system, in other words, so that you're trying to over time reduce human intervention and end up with something that can sort of look after itself and be much more adaptable, for example, to climate change, but also to a whole range of other things. So I guess all the sort of, if you like, island biogeography theory shows that the bigger the area you have, the better chances you are of having that. So those two things are kind of what we're running with. They're sort of two parallel agendas, if you like.
Great, thank you, Leslie. I think we have time for two more questions. Colin, I see your hands up. Would you like to ask another question?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, a bit cheeky coming back with a second question. I think you've answered much of it in the previous question plus one about the ownership and I don't know whether you are aware of Guy Standing's work on the plunder of the commons and the whole question of enclosure. And I mean, there's some of that's quite political and historical, but I wondered again about the way that these properties are managed. And I think you've already more or less answered a lot of it, but how inalienable that is, or whether there could be a situation of a trust getting into either community or your own trust, heaven forbid, you know, but getting into financial trouble, being unable to hold on to land, or having to change its use in order to generate more income for some reason, and giving up on some of the objectives.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that some of the earlier community buyouts, and I wouldn't be breaking confidence, as I mentioned, the Ascent Foundation have had real financial troubles over the years. And actually, with hindsight, part of it was the land that was sold by the owner. In that case, the best land for housing and development stuff wasn't sold, so they ended up in a bit like, you know. So, and you could argue we own the top of Ben Nevis, which is the John Muir Trust, which is fantastic. But you know, any opportunity to do anything else, it has all the money for maintaining the footpath has to come from outside. You know, we can't generate that anyway, and we don't charge access or anything. So you're absolutely right. I think there are challenges that way. But so far, I think there's probably quite a lot of political capital invested in this to sort of make sure things don't fail. So, you know, there would be quite unless there was a change of government in Scotland, it would be quite difficult it would be hard, it would be, you know, embarrassing and politically not great if a community, you know, buyout was to fail. So there's probably a lot of political goodwill behind and in the scenes to make that happen. But you are right. I mean, there are challenges longer term, and also trying to, you know, we need to try and look at, as I say, you know, paying public goods for public benefit. So, you know, whether there's payments for climate change mitigation or carbon. And actually, there's been a big investment in peatland restoration recently, in tens of millions, hundreds of millions of pounds, certainly in Scotland. And that's great because people can sort of do the right thing and be paid for it as opposed to doing the wrong thing. And so, but yeah, I think it's still early days, and there are challenges. And as I say, the big challenge is the fact that in the past, these large estates were run, you know, they weren't run in any economic model. They were run as either a tax incentive or a plaything or something to impress people with, which is we've still got that legacy. I mean, I do contrast with other countries. If you look at Ireland or Norway, where there's, you know, much smaller land holdings and people have much more integrated land use, certainly in Norway and in southwest Norway, you know, that's quite a different model. And so if you're designing a model of land, community land ownership, you wouldn't end up with even the community buyout model that we have now for a whole range of reasons. You know, you probably start with something different. So yeah, there is going to be challenges as to how far this model can, you know, generate the sort of wealth that needs to keep it going.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Colin. So should we have a quick final question from David about inheritance tax? David, I think you're on mute again.
Thank you for your patience, everybody. Yeah, as far as I can see it, given that there is no inheritance tax, as I understand it, on landed estates, it's a no-brainer for any billionaire or even a lesser decamillionaire to put all their assets in land, upraising the price of it for everybody else. Given the separate legislation for Scotland, is there any chance, at least in Scotland, of them taking away that exemption as a step towards communities and smaller individuals having a share and an influence in land policy and actually what happens on the ground?
Thanks, David. It was a little bit broken up, but I think I got the gist of that. So yes, I don't actually know the answer directly. What I do know is that certainly the Scottish Green Party, I think, among others, there's certainly, as I say, a land valuation tax has been proposed and is quite well advanced as a you know, as a mechanism. And there's a lot of, you know, purely from community ecological point of view, there's a lot of merit in that approach. So certainly, I think yes, you're right. It certainly is on the agenda, and again, as I say, the Scottish Land Commission looks at a whole range of things, all sorts of policies. So it's talked about, but yeah, I don't know specifically whether there's any plans to do what you're suggesting just yet.
Great, thank you, David. Thank you, Mike, for answering those questions, and thank you everybody else who asked a question. Bonnie, would you like to talk about the next stage?
All right, so we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're in some ways fortunately reduced a bit in number, so the breakout rooms will be a bit more manageable. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. We did have a few questions that we wanted you to consider, which I'm about to put up on the share. That's working. If you can see that, someone can tell me. Yeah, is that good? So really the questions are relating very much to Mike's talk, but it's a question of what do you think about these issues? What kind of ideas do you have? The first one is about what do you think the best land management policies or practices are for achieving the goals? In particular, we're talking about climate change, wildland biodiversity here. And there's been some talk about the advantages and disadvantages of different land ownership models. So again, what are your views on this question? And maybe some of you also maybe have something to say about the issues of engaging with communities, because there's been some very good questions about sort of the issues and the problems in making sure that there's some kind of democratic participation. And lastly, which relates to also some of the questions, what are the possibilities for using some of the things we've learned here to transfer them to a place like London or Manchester or something? So these are the kind of things there'll be to think about in your groups. There'll be a facilitator in every breakout room who will know what they're doing. And the idea is to talk for now about 15 minutes, we hope, and then come back and do the usual reporting back. We are running a little bit behind schedule here, but were some very interesting questions, so it was worth pursuing, I think. So the facilitators will have these questions. I'm going to stop sharing at the moment, and I'm about to do the breakout rooms, and all of a sudden you're going to magically appear in another room. So Mike, if you decide you're going to end up in a room because I can't keep you out, but if you can always choose to come back to the main session, and rather than necessarily be the focus, you might need a little breather after having been the focus of all of that. So I'm going to click the button and off you go. So are the people still here? You're not going into a breakout room? I'm recording, and all this will be up on the blog, and there'll also be some notes taken, and all of this we're hoping is going to contribute to the developing of our people's land policy. If you haven't been able to say what you've wanted to say in the answer to the questions, do feel free to email us with any ideas that you have on some of these questions. So I guess I'll start. Alec, you're there at the top of my page, so we'll start with your group.
Okay, So it was in a group with Marina, Fred and Archie. We talked about, we had a more general discussion around the questions. We talked about the needs for joined up thinking, a strategic scale when looking at issues of land management, land ownership, and the need to really be holistic about how we sort of approach these things. What was felt is that there was really the need for communities to really re-engage in their natural environments as a way of building up the local knowledge. But the issue, I think we all agreed, was how does that local knowledge then translate into national policy, global consensus, and that sort of thing? Like, how does it build up into that sort of regional and national way? And the other comment that was interested is that we'll be really interested to know whether the John Muir Trust sort of chronicles the responses of local communities to the projects over many, many years. So we can see if there's any common themes, because we think it'll be really interesting to see those sorts of reports and what we can actually learn from understanding the sort of long-term vision of these projects, and whether there's anything in them that can help us approach our individual projects. I think that was it. Marina and Fred, did you have any other comments you'd like to add to that? Right. Okay. Oh, sorry, Bonnie, I think you're on mute again.
David King is the next in my picture list.
Thanks. Yeah, we didn't answer all the questions, but we had a very good discussion. So I don't think we had any sort of like particular sort of like management practices in answer to the first one. But what came through was sort of like being clear about what your priorities are, and also what came up was the issue that, that there were many like stakeholders involved in this, and that's like part of the process was managing relationships and trying to like balance different priorities, and maybe even trying to achieve consensus around what the priorities were. One of the themes that's like came through all of the discussion, I think, was around consultations, like an engagement, that it sort of like ebbed and flowed, and that you needed, you needed to think about sort of like community engagement and community involvement in a sustainable way, not necessarily in terms of sort of, consultation sort of like exercises. And I think another theme that sort of like came through was not necessarily sort of like talking to the same old places. I'm not trying to be pejorative of the old there, but actually sort of like having processes that actively engaged young people in meaningful ways was sort of like really important. And I think there was some reference to sort of like, the school strike and all the work that's gone in around Extinction Rebellion in sort of like engaging with youth. But that engaging communities is sort of like quite difficult. It really is quite difficult, and that you need to sort of like balance. If you do become an organisation, for example, you have to sort of like balance that engagement with decision-making sort of like processes, because consensus is great, but it takes a lot of time in terms of trying to sort of like influence processes. Becoming an organisation can give you sort of like status, but it also might limit the influence you have, or your range of campaigning activities, shall I say. So if Crystal, Toby, or Anna, or Mike indeed want to chip in, that's it from me. Sorry, back to you, Bonnie.
Still on mute, Bonnie.
We can't hear you, Bonnie.
So I was asking David to unmute, and I needed to unmute myself. All right, David.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Yeah, we thought we'd be very clever and start with the last question on the assumption that a lot of you wouldn't get there. So we began with how might we translate this to sort of policies to the urban environment. The first question was, to what extent could we, for example, rewild London? And there's actually a heck of a lot of unbuilt on public space. London isn't that densified a city. The built footprint isn't that high. We could sort of reduce the amount of mowing of grass and let sort of a bigger variety of things grow there. We could, look at the canal space, the space underneath overhead motorways, and so on, and encourage rewilding there. We could have more green stuff on top of roofs throughout any city. You can have a green roof. It's not that difficult technologically. Issues about building policy, the government talking about 45k new houses. Okay, some of us lived in a time when Harold Macmillan sort of put up about 300,000 council houses in a year, but hey, that was then. And the issues, the tension between what kind of building you have. We've got 30 million empty bedrooms every night in the UK. How about using those? How about using empty spaces becoming available in offices which people don't want any longer? How about doing conversions? And then there's a architect's technological question about whether it's cheaper, whether it's more ecological to build anew from scratch, as one architect we know says, rather than actually just do the conversion. In terms of the question 3 about engaging the community, given the time issues, how do you participate if you've got a demanding job and kids to look after? The availability of like expert help, as has happened, some of the people in here have that expertise, sort of briefing, communities would help. Also, a biggie for me is baby boomers of my generation who are convinced that they're doing great by sort of sitting on property whose assets, the asset value nominally has increased 10 or 20 times during their lifetime, and they're just occupying space, which there should be more incentives without sort of bullying people to sort of share spaces. I mean, actually not everybody wants to live by themselves, or even with a nuclear family. Flat shares, that sort of thing, could be more part of what is going on. We know that going up to about 5 stories, people actually like, and is one efficient way of packing people in if you're going to have a 3rd child or whatever, and create that demand on the land. I'm sure that I remember various other issues we came up with, but at the moment, unless Jim or Steve can recall any of the other bits, that's my main bit of feedback.
That's not bad for 3 of you. So, Richard?
George is going to share some ideas from our group.
Yeah, hi guys. It actually follows on quite nicely from previous point, because it was originally we started off in the room with just myself and so it was Colin, right? Anyway, missed the name, bad at names. But we were talking about, I think, because Colin was working in just space. So we were kind of starting to think about it from a kind of more urban context, and a background doing research into housing cooperatives, and we're kind of drawing the parallel between some of the stuff that's happening in the examples which we're discussing through John Muir with the real world in the land, and the kind of the classic housing cooperative model in the kind of urban situation, of which in the UK in sort of 60s and 70s there was a real kind of spate of these kind of quite amazing institutions kind of being set up, and using those as a kind of chance to reflect on the fact that actually on that question I think that was raised in the talk, which was really interesting about the difference between publicly owned land and then these kind of particular community owned lands projects, and what the kind of relative differences between those different models would be. And obviously kind of learning from what I think one of the things you can learn from a kind of housing cooperative model is that when you get kind of community ownership, it's the particularity and it's the actual process of the owning which is the important bit, as opposed to maybe in the kind of publicly owned land model, you've kind of lost something. It's publicly owned in name but maybe not in nature. That was kind of one thing we were kind of thinking about, and then looking at some of the barriers to housing, because I think there's like in the housing context, one of the most tragic things when you look at it is that there are so many which get unrealised, and I was wondering we were kind of wondering whether it was the same with you know, in the context of community rights by land, and that was kind of led on to a question about drawing a comparison between the Localism Act in the UK, which is kind of supposedly kind of built up community right to buy, again mainly that's from kind of assets and housing point of view, but that hasn't actually been very successful in enabling this kind of this huge interest actually in buying and managing assets by the community. It hasn't kind of converted into the number of projects you might hope to see, and there's kind of question about whether the incentives behind the Localism Act might be different to the incentives behind the Land Reform Act, and they're kind of coming from slightly different political persuasions, perspectives, agendas, and so on. So we're talking a bit about that. And then James and Bonnie joined, and James has got experience working with volunteer groups in John Muir. And so we were reflecting on whether the kind of the tensions between sort of a kind of a slightly purer conservationism that might be part of the kind of John Muir Trust, and the kind of more community focused approach that we kind of started to hear a bit about in the talk, whether they were tensions or not, whether they were working together, whether it was kind of a tactical, you know, using communities in a tactical way to support conservationism, or whether it was intrinsically valuable. Yeah, so sorry, it's a bit rambling. I don't know if I've got everything.
Okay, lastly, Leslie, unless you want to add anything more, Richard, no?
No, that was fine.
Okay.
Richard,
Leslie?
sorry, not Richard. Richard, not Colin.
All right, Leslie?
Well, I was privileged enough to have two people who know each other very well, Veronique and Alistair from the West Highlands Morburn project. So you'll have to correct me, guys, if I make a mistake. We were very disciplined and kept to the questions. They started saying they know nothing about the urban situation, but they know an awful lot about the whole, well, other things. And so for question one, they were talking about land management. Just going through very quickly, saying that the custodianship should be the model rather than ownership. And you need to look at the long-term benefits, multiple benefits of what you do. So there might be economic benefits in 100 years, but there might be immediate benefits as, say, growing an oak tree. There was also some questioning of the whole issue of wild land concept and whether that was more ideal and a future hope rather than the reality now of biodiversity and climate change, which needs other more concrete immediate actions. And I'm sorry, just reading, and the impact. We need to eat now. We need a good environment to live in, so that the idea of wildland was maybe for mental health, but it's less immediate and less imperative. On the second question, the different land ownerships, it's always best to consider multiple options and the scale, so that there isn't one best option, but it depends on your situation and it relates to the people and the place. But they said that, and the third question about engaging the community, in their situation, there's 300 people who live there and they're all know each other very well and they all have an opinion, which is absolutely fantastic, engaged, but they also there's a lot of disagreement and it's magnified. And somebody said, I can't remember which of them said, that the absentee landlord was the enemy of good land management, which I thought was a really good way to put it. They have a situation where huge forests are owned and managed, and they're contracted out. So, and there's only one person on an 8,000 hectare site of woodland who's local and who's being employed locally. And there are obviously other ways to do this and much better. They also use the word sustainable to do a clear fell approach to taking the trees down, which means sustainable in this case means they can do it year after year, but we need to change that word, and it was suggested that we use the word regenerative, so that it actually puts back more than it takes. So it's not just sustainable in the sense of over and over. And then, having said they know nothing about the urban situation, they both came out with amazing sort of phrases about how these lessons that they've learned from the very rural can translate to the urban, which is to the community spirit. So wherever you are, you need community spirit. And if you work together, you can create magic, and you can create a little corner of wildness in anywhere. Okay, that's me. So tell me, you guys want to chip in?
It was by accident that they ended up in the same group, so it wasn't planned.
I realized that, I think.
Just one thing is that we also mentioned when it comes in regards to biodiversity and wild land, is that I mentioned also that I think agroforestry, where you actually kind of use a type of farming but actually take the soil into account, might be a great way of increasing biodiversity. Yeah.
Okay, so we are running a little bit late. So we're going to have the final thing is just Richard's going to sort of say something a little bit about the next steps, what we're planning on doing with all this material. And obviously we all want to thank Mike.
Yes. So very, very briefly, I'm hoping people can just about see that, which is the document that Bonnie referred to at the start of the session today, working towards a people's land policy. And this is working towards, it's some initial thoughts that some of us have had. And we're really keen through the series of seminars that we're holding now to bring further ideas and further voices into the development of this policy document. So I think if Bonnie hasn't done it already, and she may have done, there will be an invitation coming round to you, inviting you to join the policy group, as we call ourselves. And it would be really great to have more voices and more inputs within the policy development that we're doing. Our aim is to really build a strong movement, but one that is based on activity on the ground, that's very, very much focused on what's happening practically for communities. And I should mention perhaps finally that in 2 weeks we have the third session in this series, which is on the question of land mining and communities. And we've got speakers organised through the London Mining Network, which is a group that takes an international perspective on all of this, but also doesn't forget some of the ongoing mining issues across the United Kingdom as well. And we're looking forward to this because at the moment we don't have a well-developed international section in our policy document. And we're really hoping that the session in 2 weeks' time will really help us to create a narrative for including some international work on our policy. So that's 2 weeks today, is that right, Bonnie? On the Tuesday, the 18th of August.
I will send an email out with all the information and the contacts and things like that. So I suppose we could only finish by really thanking Mike for really a superb presentation that I think, you know, we all really got a lot out of. And I'm really pleased that there was a good spread across the country. And I hope, Mike, you enjoyed the questions and your experience with this. And I mean, I have sent out information already about the John Muir Trust. I'll do a publicity thing for them. It's certainly worth being a member. He hasn't really talked about what it's like to be a member, but they actually are, within reason, quite a democratic organization in their own right. You know, it's not just joining and then you never do anything. You can actually join and you can go to AGMs and you can go on volunteer groups and you can actually get involved in stuff. So it is worth looking at. Even living in London, it's worth thinking about becoming a member. So Mike, did you have anything last that you'd like to say?
No, thank you very much. That was a good plug. Thanks, Bonnie.
Right, so we'll be ending the meeting. And Mike, if I could just ask you to stay a couple of minutes so we can have a quick chat with you before you go off to your dinner. And but everyone else, I suppose, hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Yeah. Bye. Bye, Steve. Where's Richard? It's just us. Oh, well. Well, so Mike, I hope that was, I thought it went well. I thought it's just the sort of thing people wanted to, you know, were you happy with that?
Yeah, no, that was excellent. Yeah, I wasn't entirely sure what to expect and wasn't sure what to pitch at, but hopefully that was about right. And yeah, no, I think our yeah, I think we, as you probably saw, some of our comms, but we put something out in one of our newsletters about it. So I think that's why you had quite a few folk from John Muir Trust, which was great. I mean, that was really good.